The Maytag refrigerator plant covered more than 40 football fields of land in western Illinois. Most of it is empty. In September 2004, 1,600 people came to work here for the last time. The company that owned this plant was Maytag, and what it did here would become one of the more documented cases of American deindustrialization of that decade. What it did here, in this town of 33,000 people in western Illinois, it believed was the only decision left to it. The board agreed, the analysts agreed, Wall Street agreed. 3 years later, the company that made this decision no longer existed. It had been acquired by its largest competitor, Whirlpool Corporation. And in a town in Iowa, a town that had built its entire identity around Maytag for nearly a century, the consequences were just beginning. The morning of October 11th, 2002 started like any other morning in Galesburg. By noon, the town had a 2-year countdown. Maytag's announcement was not a rumor. It was not a warning sign that workers could point to later and say they had seen coming. The plant had been on this site for 52 years. At its peak, it had employed nearly 5,000 people, roughly 1 in every 7 residents of the city. By 2002, that number had come down to 1,600. But 1,600 was still the largest single employer in a county seat of 33,000. A union official described sitting through contract negotiations that had concluded just 6 months before the announcement, watching 45 years of provisions get stripped from the agreement, things the workers had gone on strike to win, terms the company said it needed in order to stay. She started her new union position the day the closure was announced. The plant would not close immediately. That was part of the arrangement. Workers would keep their jobs for another 2 years while Maytag moved production south. What none of them could know, what nobody would understand clearly until years later, was that Maytag was not trying to abandon Galesburg. It was trying to survive. To understand what Galesburg lost, it helps to know what Galesburg had. This was not a single industry town in the way that phrase is usually understood. Galesburg sat on a major rail corridor, and the Burlington Northern Santa Fe main line still runs through the center of the city. It had a courthouse, a hospital, a downtown that predated the Maytag plant by generations. Knox College had been here since before the Civil War. Carl Sandburg, the poet, was born 4 blocks from the courthouse. It was, in other words, a town that was supposed to have options. Maytag arrived in Galesburg in the early 1950s. The company itself was older than that. Founded in Newton, Iowa in 1893, it had grown from farm equipment into washing machines, and by mid-century into a full line of American home appliances. The brand had a specific meaning in American households: durability, the repairman with nothing to do, the machine that outlasted everything else. At its peak in the early 1970s, close to 5,000 people worked at this facility. In a city of around 30,000 people, that number was not just employment. It was the property tax base, the reason certain stores stayed open, the reason the school district had what it had. When a single employer accounts for that share of a city's economy, the employer does not merely provide jobs. It provides the conditions for everything else. By 2002, the workforce had contracted to 1,600. Maytag had not closed the Galesburg plant. It had made choices over the previous 2 decades that reduced it, consolidated it, and kept it running but smaller. 1,600 was a fraction of 5,000. But in 2002, it was still the largest concentration of employment in Knox County. The competitive landscape Maytag was operating in by the late 1990s was not the one the company had been built for. Big box retailers had entered the appliance market. Home Depot, Lowe's, companies operating at a scale that reversed the traditional relationship between manufacturer and retailer. At that scale, the retailer does not accept the manufacturer's price. It names one. Maytag, along with every other appliance maker, found itself being asked to produce cheaper products at thinner margins by companies that had the shelf space to back up the demand. At the same time, the global manufacturing map for refrigerators was shifting. Other producers, including Electrolux and GE Appliances, had begun making cheaper refrigerator models in Mexico. Maytag already had sub-assembly operations in Reynosa, a city of roughly 1 million people just south of the Texas border, across the Rio Grande from McAllen. The infrastructure was in place. The supply chains were established. What the board was considering in 2001 and 2002 was straightforward arithmetic. The word for what they were contemplating had become common enough in American business by then: outsourcing, offshoring more precisely, moving production not to a third party, but to a lower-cost country. A refrigerator of the cheaper variety requires approximately 3 hours of direct labor to assemble. Workers at the Galesburg plant earned $14.42 an hour. 3 hours at that rate, roughly $43 per unit. Workers in Reynosa, assembling the same product, were earning $1.10 an hour. 3 hours at that rate, $3.30. The gap, approximately $40 in direct labor per unit, translates to roughly $50 on the retail price of a refrigerator costing $350, before accounting for differences in regulatory costs. That is the number Maytag's board was looking at in 2002. That $50 figure is the number that explains what happened to 1,600 people in a city of 33,000 in western Illinois. The city of Reynosa held approximately 10 industrial parks full of maquiladoras, companies from outside Mexico, operating under programs offering preferential tax treatment, lower regulatory costs, and wages a fraction of what those same companies would pay in the United States. Roughly 204 companies were already operating there, including Black & Decker and Whirlpool, Maytag's largest American competitor, already producing in Mexico, while Maytag still produced in Illinois. Those arrangements operated under NAFTA's framework, and in later years would be restructured under what became known as the IMEX program, Mexico's Manufacturing Export Industry Program, which formalized and expanded the tax preferences that had drawn companies like Maytag to the border in the first place. Maytag had watched Whirlpool gain cost advantage. The board had concluded this was not a sustainable position. Revenue was not collapsing, profits were not gone, but both were stagnant or declining. The stock price had dropped. The pressure was real and it was specific. The Galesburg refrigerator operation was a cost problem, and the cost problem had what looked like a solution. On October 11, 2002, Maytag announced it would close the Galesburg plant and move refrigerator production to a new facility being built in Reynosa. The plan was not complicated. Lower labor costs, restore margins, satisfy Wall Street, survive. The union immediately began fighting it. The local machinists' union, the International Association of Machinists, took their case to the streets, to the press, to Maytag shareholders. They went to politicians. Their stated goal was to make Maytag the poster child of a campaign demonstrating that companies were cutting costs in ways that did not pass savings to consumers. The refrigerator that cost $350 when Galesburg workers made it was not going to cost $300 once Reynosa workers made it instead. They were not wrong about that. They also could not stop the closure. What none of them knew in October 2002, what the union didn't know, what the workers didn't know, and what Maytag's own board did not fully reckon with, was that this plan was not going to work. The Reynosa plant was under construction. The timeline was set. Galesburg workers would hold their jobs until the new facility was ready to absorb production. What Maytag discovered over the 2 years that followed was that the move made for financial reasons was not producing the financial results projected. The costs of the transition were real. Moving a manufacturing operation across a border is not straightforward. Training a new workforce, establishing supply chains, managing quality on a line that previously had decades of accumulated institutional knowledge. These are not costs that appear in the original arithmetic. Reporting from Reynosa after the move found that the plan had fallen considerably short of what was projected. The margin problem that drove the Galesburg decision did not disappear. By 2005, Maytag was not a company that had successfully restructured. It was a company for sale. Whirlpool Corporation announced its acquisition of Maytag in 2005. The deal closed in 2006. Federal antitrust regulators raised no objection. Whirlpool was already the largest appliance maker in the country. Adding Maytag extended that position further. It was the kind of consolidation that had been reshaping the appliance industry for decades. The same forces squeezing Maytag's margins were accelerating mergers across the sector, with GE Appliances, Electrolux, and Whirlpool absorbing smaller competitors. Less than 6 weeks after the acquisition closed, Whirlpool announced what it intended to do with what it had bought. 3 Maytag manufacturing plants would close. The Maytag corporate headquarters would close. The research center would close. Administrative offices across the United States, Canada, and Mexico would close. 4,500 jobs would be eliminated in total. 3 of those manufacturing plants were in Herrin, Illinois, Searcy, Arkansas, and Newton, Iowa. Newton, Iowa, where Maytag had been founded. Newton, Iowa, where the company had been headquartered for over a century. Newton, Iowa, where, as it happened, a few dozen of the jobs that had left Galesburg 2 years earlier had been redirected. Scene: Galesburg during the countdown 2003-2004, the plant running on borrowed time. The Galesburg plant ran for 2 more years after the announcement. Workers came in, the line kept moving, refrigerators came off it, the same refrigerators made by the same people, in the same building, by workers who understood the building would eventually be empty. The union continued fighting. None of it changed the outcome. In the spring and summer of 2004, the layoffs began in stages. 380 reductions came in autumn 2003. The remaining 1,320 workers were expected to lose their jobs by the end of 2004. By September, the plant had run its last refrigerator. 1,600 jobs, a site that had been producing for 52 years, a facility that had, at its peak, given 1 in every 7 residents of the city a place to work. Scene: Galesburg, October 2004, the immediate aftermath, the streets after. In October 2004, the unemployment rate in Galesburg was 9.1%. The property taxes Maytag had been paying, the revenues that had allowed Knox County to function as it had for half a century, were no longer being paid. Remaining residents absorbed the difference. The site sat largely empty. Contaminated, as it turned out, chromium and chemical solvents in the soil and groundwater beneath it. Cleaning it up was Whirlpool's responsibility under the terms of its acquisition of Maytag. Displaced workers were eligible to apply for trade adjustment assistance, the federal TAA program administered by the Department of Labor for workers whose jobs are lost to trade-related outsourcing or offshoring. The Galesburg Maytag workers were certified under TAA, which provided extended unemployment benefits and retraining funding. It was the federal government's designed response to exactly this kind of loss. Here is the moment to stop, because the story of what happened to those 1,600 jobs does not end with the plant closing. The work did not disappear. It moved. Most of it went south to Reynosa. Some went to Daewoo, a Korean subcontractor, then building its own facility in Mexico. And a few dozen jobs, a small number, but a specific and documented number, went to a plant in Iowa. Newton, Iowa sits 35 miles east of Des Moines in Jasper County. Population 16,000. The Maytag Corporation had been there since 1893. The company had not just employed Newton, it had, in a meaningful sense, built it. At its peak, Maytag had 4,000 workers in a town of 16,000. 1 in 4 residents, not 1 in 7, as in Galesburg. 1 in 4. The washers and dryers that came off the Newton line were different products from the refrigerators made in Galesburg. Different division, different workers, different union agreements. When Maytag closed Galesburg, Newton was not immediately threatened. It was the company's home. The headquarters were there. The research center was there. The brand identity, a century of American manufacturing, was rooted in this city. Scene: Maytag Corporate Headquarters, Newton, Iowa, exterior, archive or present day. Maytag was acquired by Whirlpool in 2006. On May 10, 2006, less than 6 weeks after the acquisition closed, Whirlpool announced it would close the Newton manufacturing plant and the Maytag corporate headquarters. The production, washers and dryers would move to non-union plants in Clyde and Marion, Ohio, where workers earned significantly less than the union-represented workforce in Newton. The corporate headquarters would merge into Whirlpool's facility in Benton Harbor, Michigan. Net job loss in Newton, approximately 1,800. Scene: Newton, the final day, October 25th, 2007. The factory floor, the parking lot. The last washers and dryers rolled off the Maytag assembly line in Newton on October 25, 2007. 550 workers left the 2 million square foot factory for the last time. Many had never worked anywhere else. A number had parents who had worked there before them. Some left their work boots hanging on the fence outside the plant, a sign that they would not need them the next morning. Now, the detail that connects these two stories. When the Galesburg plant closed in September 2004, the work that 1,600 people had been doing was distributed across 3 destinations. Most went to Reynosa, some went to Daewoo, and a few dozen jobs, a small number, but a verified and documented number, went to a plant in Iowa, to Newton. Galesburg's escape route was Newton, and Newton was not a safe harbor. It was the next town on the list. The company that closed Galesburg was trying to survive. It did not survive. And the company that finished the job, that closed Newton and moved production again, this time to non-union plants in Ohio, where wages were lower than they had been in Iowa, made that announcement before the paperwork on the acquisition was 6 weeks old. The plan that closed Galesburg was designed to save Maytag. It saved nothing. It moved the consequences. Scene: Galesburg, present day, the downtown, Knox College, the railroad, the former site, the town that is still here. Galesburg in 2004 was not Newton in 2007. That distinction is worth making. Newton was smaller, more singularly dependent, and had no equivalent of Knox College in its economic base. When the Maytag headquarters left Newton, the town lost not just manufacturing jobs, but executive salaries, corporate tax revenues, research employment, and the prestige of being home to a nationally recognized brand. Galesburg had the railroad. It had the college. It had the courthouse and the hospital and blocks of downtown that had existed before Maytag arrived and continued to exist after it left. None of that prevented a serious decline, but it shaped what that decline looked like. In the years immediately following the closure, Knox County absorbed the loss the way county economies absorb these things, slowly, unevenly, and in ways that don't show up in a single statistic. Illinois lost 37% of its manufacturing jobs during the 2000s, most of them before the Great Recession began in 2008. Nationally, 5.8 million manufacturing jobs disappeared in that decade. Galesburg's loss was part of that wave, part of what economists and historians would come to call the deindustrialization of the Rust Belt, the broad hollowing out of the manufacturing corridor that had once stretched from Illinois through Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania, which made it neither unique nor easier to navigate. The site itself became a long-term project. Contaminated soil and groundwater required years of active remediation. By 2008, the EPA reported that approximately 154 acres were ready for reuse. The name Appliance City stuck, part official designation, part civic shorthand for the problem the town had been trying to solve since the last refrigerator came off the line. Knox College continues to operate. It has served, by several measures, as one of the more durable economic anchors in the region, a consistent source of employment, student spending, and a reason for some residents to stay in Galesburg rather than leave for larger cities. The railroad still moves freight through the center of the city. The courthouse remains. The hospital remains. What the numbers tell more clearly than any individual story is that the population has declined. The people who left after 2004 did not, for the most part, return. The workers who had been employed at the Maytag plant faced a specific difficulty that manufacturing jobs of that kind had created. Wages of $14.42 an hour, good benefits, and in many cases, no college degree. Not because those workers were less capable, but because that job had not required one, and had paid well enough that seeking one had not been economically necessary. Finding work that paid $30,000 to $40,000 a year with comparable benefits in a Midwestern city of 33,000 whose largest employer had just left was not a straightforward project in 2004 or 2005. Knox College's proximity offered retraining options. The Trade Adjustment Assistant certification meant federal funding was available for that retraining. State transition programs existed. Some workers found new employment at comparable wages. Others did not. Chad Broughton, a Knox College faculty member who spent a decade following both cities, Galesburg and Reynosa, produced the most comprehensive documented record of what actually happened on both ends of the move. His book, Boom Bust Exodus, notes that the prediction most commonly made in October 2002 was that Galesburg would become a ghost town. It did not become a ghost town. What it became was smaller and slower and different, which is a different kind of loss than disappearing, and in some ways a harder one to articulate, because it does not have a single date or a final image. The refrigerators Maytag made in Galesburg for 52 years are still in use, some of them. The brand still appears on appliances sold in American stores today. Whirlpool continues to sell products under the Maytag name. The factory is not there. The 1,600 jobs are not there. And the company that made those refrigerators in this building, that built its first model here, that employed 1 in 7 people in this city at its peak, is not there either. Not as it was. Not as it understood itself to be. The site in Galesburg has a name. Appliance City. The town gave it that name, and they've kept it, which is either optimism or memory, possibly both. The company that built this plant operated here for 52 years. The decision to leave took considerably less time than that. What the record shows is this. The closure of the Galesburg plant was a financial decision made by a profitable company facing margin pressure. It was legal. It was documented. It was made through a normal corporate process. The board believed it would work. The analysts agreed. The company ceased to exist 4 years later. The work that 1,600 Galesburg workers had been doing moved south to Mexico, to a Korean partner, and, a small amount, east to Iowa, to the town where the company had been founded, to the town the company had, for over a century, been synonymous with. That town's plant closed in 2007. There is one more part to that story. What Newton, Iowa did afterward, what a town of 16,000 does with 1.9 million square feet of empty space, and what happens when the company that defined you for a century decides the numbers no longer work. That story is linked above.